The United States has carried out a military operation in Caracas, Venezuela, capturing its president Nicolas Maduro on drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. This is what was shown on the news. But that version of events is too neat to be true, because the US doesn't respond to internal crises in this way. But wait, they did it before. So why Venezuela? Well, the real reason isn't this guy or his allies, and it's definitely not oil. It's Venezuela's geography, where it sits on the map, who it borders, and what flows past its coast. And in this video, we'll explain why its geography became, or will become, its biggest curse. Let's pull the map up, because it makes one thing clear. Venezuela is simply too close to ignore. It sits on the northern edge of South America, right on the Caribbean Sea. Its capital, Caracas, is closer to Miami than Los Angeles is. It shares borders with Colombia, one of America's most important security partners in the region, and Guyana, a small country that just struck one of the largest oil discoveries in the Western Hemisphere. And just west of Venezuela lies the Panama Canal, a trade choke point that connects the Atlantic to the Pacific. Any instability here doesn't just affect local politics, it threatens the arteries of global commerce. In other words, Venezuela isn't isolated. It's plugged into some of the most important trade, energy, and security routes in the world. Because Venezuela isn't landlocked, it has a coastline. Its oil, the largest proven reserves on Earth, has to flow outward. And most of it moves by sea, through waters long patrolled by the US Navy. That means oil in Venezuela isn't just a resource, it's a vulnerability. And in recent years, that vulnerability was exploited, not by the US, but by its rivals. As American sanctions ramped up, Venezuela began selling oil under the table, using ghost tankers, false flags, and shadow fleets to funnel crude to China, Russia, and Iran. Billions of dollars flowed through these routes, and in doing so, Venezuela was quietly helping other nations sidestep US control over global oil pricing and over the petrodollar itself. That's a strategic threat to the United States, and that threat didn't stay confined to oil. In the last 5 years, China has invested heavily in Caribbean ports, in Panama, Trinidad, and Jamaica. It's offered loans, built infrastructure, secured access, often near major shipping lanes or military zones. Russia, meanwhile, deepened ties with Venezuela's security apparatus. The Western Hemisphere, long considered America's backyard, suddenly had new guests. That's when old doctrines returned. Back in 1823, the US issued what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, a warning that foreign powers should stay out of the Americas. And while the world has changed, that idea never truly disappeared. Because in Washington, it wasn't just Maduro's alliances that raised alarms. It was his invitation to foreign influence in a region the US still sees as its own. And the costs weren't just strategic, they were human. As Venezuela's economy collapsed, over 7 million people fled the country, triggering one of the largest refugee crises in the world. Most ended up in Colombia, Brazil, or Peru, putting enormous pressure on regional governments already stretched thin. Armed groups and smuggling networks used the porous jungle borders to move drugs, weapons, and people, destabilizing regions that the US had spent decades trying to stabilize. All of this, the oil flows, the sea lanes, the foreign influence, the mass migration, had one thing in common. Geography made them possible. And when you stack those pieces together, oil bypassing sanctions, rival powers gaining ground, borders leaking in every direction, the outcome starts to feel less like a sudden reaction and more like a long-planned correction. Because in a region this important, the US doesn't act out of impulse. It acts because geography forces its hand. By the time the world saw the headlines, helicopters in Caracas, Maduro in custody, the US claiming victory, The real battle was already over. Not the military one, the strategic one. Because this wasn't the kind of mission you greenlight overnight. It was the final chapter in a quiet, multi-year buildup. It began with intelligence. The US has spent years tracking Venezuela's oil routes, mapping its naval movements, intercepting shadow fleet traffic, and planting cyber tools to monitor refinery activity. But surveillance alone wasn't enough. The Pentagon needed regional access, and that came quietly. In 2022, the US expanded military cooperation with Colombia. By 2024, troops were cycling through joint exercises near Venezuela's border. Around the same time, naval operations increased in the Caribbean, publicly framed as anti-smuggling efforts, but in reality, designed to build familiarity with the terrain. And then came diplomacy. While Venezuela was drifting toward China and Russia, the US was rebuilding influence in Guyana, Suriname, and Brazil. It signed new trade deals, reopened military attaché offices, and helped regional partners with drone surveillance and border control. On paper, it all looked unrelated, but in hindsight, it was a tightening noose. By late 2025, Venezuela's position had become fragile. Internally, food shortages were growing again. The shadow fleet had slowed after multiple tankers were seized, and public protests, while still suppressed, were becoming harder to contain. Maduro's inner circle was splintering. A few key officials had even defected. And that's when the window opened. In the early hours of January 3rd, the US launched a military operation to capture Nicolas Maduro and his wife in Caracas. It began with precision airstrikes across northern Venezuela, aimed at knocking out air defenses and jamming communications. Once the skies were clear, stealth helicopters moved in under the cover of darkness. The sound of low-flying aircraft, explosions in the distance, and a total blackout of signals left Venezuelan forces disoriented. In that chaos, US Special Forces landed near key compounds, including the presidential residence and military command posts. The US Special Delta Force was tasked with carrying out the extraction. They broke through, found the targets, and extracted Maduro and Celia Flores. This was not a negotiation. And within minutes, they were already outside Venezuelan airspace, on their way to face charges in the US. The raid lasted under 4 hours. No US casualties reported. Maduro and his wife were extracted. And within hours, a new caretaker government, prearranged and US-aligned, stepped into the vacuum. It all happened so quickly and so cleanly, it almost didn't feel real. But in many ways, this was the modern playbook. Because the US no longer needs full-scale invasions like Iraq in 2003, or messy occupations like Afghanistan. Now it leverages geography, alliances, technology, and timing. And Venezuela? It ticked all 4 boxes. It was close enough to strike, unstable enough to fracture, tied to enough rivals to justify action, and resource-rich enough to matter. In the world, it watched, but didn't react. Russia was distracted. China issued statements but took no action. Latin American neighbors stayed silent, relieved the chaos might end. And just like that, Venezuela's long crisis was over, at least on the surface. The headlines came and went. Markets stabilized. Oil prices dipped. Venezuela trended for a few days and then faded from the front page. But what just happened wasn't just a regime change. It was a reminder that in global politics, geography still writes the rules. Because this entire conflict, from the oil sanctions to the naval seizures, from migration pressure to the raid itself, had one thing in common: the map. Venezuela wasn't targeted because of ideology. It wasn't invaded because of tweets, speeches, or political slogans. It was targeted because of where it sits. Too close to the US coast, too important to global shipping, too vulnerable to foreign influence. And if you think that lesson ends with Venezuela, think again. Because the doctrine that justified this move, what you just saw in Venezuela wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. A 21st century version of a centuries-old rule. No rivals near American shores. But here's what's different now. This time, the rivals aren't just coming through ideology or coups. They're coming through ports, through fiber optic cables, through loans, infrastructure, and influence. China has a growing footprint in the Caribbean, building ports, securing access, creating leverage. Iran has expanded its intelligence ties in Venezuela. Russia has backed oil exports and military tech. And each time one of these players moves in, the United States recalculates. Because while the world may be shifting, the map doesn't change. And any country sitting in the wrong place with the wrong alliances might find itself caught between powerful forces once again. So, was Venezuela's downfall about corruption? Yes. Was it about oil? Absolutely. Was it about Maduro himself? Partly. But above all, it was about location. Because in geopolitics, the borders you're born with often decide the future you'll never escape.